Thanks for the invitation, Sally. And this is a talk I've done a couple of times before. This is slightly updated with some recent developments. Um, the title of the talk is Understanding Unseen Disabilities. And what I'm going to actually focus on here is really the understanding part. Um, so just to give you a little overview of what the talk is about, the talk is meant to be, at least in my mind, for everyone, both people with disabilities, their colleagues, managers, people who look after people with disabilities. And it's mainly going to be about the understanding side, because I think one of the problems that people with disability or chronic illness constantly encounter is that other people feel that they need to know what it is that they suffer with before they can understand. And the position I take is actually you don't need to know. You just need to know a little bit, and that's fine. So I'm going to talk specifically about that aspect. What I'm hoping you might get out of this is perhaps a bit of a perspective on how to think about people whose experiences and lives are very different from your own. And I particularly do need to mention COVID and the impact of COVID. Okay, so the key points I'd like to highlight up front are that much of this will apply to most forms of disability. And really, unseen disabilities are only distinguished by the unseen part. But it's important to bear in mind that they often co-occur with more visible forms of disability. And even people who have disclosed their disability or who don't have any option but to have their disability very visible to people may not have disclosed or talked about the various kinds of disabilities that they encounter and they have. Okay, so just to give a rough overview of what I'm referring to when I speak of unseen disabilities, these include the conditions in the neurodiversity spectrum, autistic spectrum disorders or autistic spectrum conditions, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and other forms of specific learning difficulties, sensory impairments, visual and auditory, chronic physical illnesses like Crohn's disease, endometriosis, HIV, chronic fatigue, with particular relevance to COVID, especially conditions that are associated with some degree of immunosuppression, either in the condition themselves or as part of the treatment for the condition. And I'll come back to why that's particularly important a bit later. Then various kinds of neurological illnesses like MS, epilepsy, any kind of mental illness, really. And long COVID is something that's particularly pertinent, and sadly, I suspect will only get more pertinent as time goes on. Now, this isn't by any means an exhaustive list, but it's just to put some sort of markers around what the kind of things we're referring to here. I'm always very keen to emphasize the fact that, that there is always a much broader context. We have systems that tend to kind of deal with situations or interactions or individuals as instances that are contained to that particular moment or that particular encounter or interaction. But it's important to bear in mind the broader context of the system that we're in and the intersectionality between different aspects of that. So our systems, predominantly in the university and other systems in the UK and a lot of the Western and Eastern world, are fundamentally designed around able-bodied people. Our systems generally tend to be patriarchal, they're white dominant, they're heterosexual dominant, and cisgender dominant. And what that means is that there are various forms of discrimination, difference, or otherness that are baked into these systems. And with particular regard to this talk, of course, is ableism. But it's important to remember that misogyny, racism, homophobia, and transphobia are often inbuilt features of a lot of the systems that we work under. And they all relate to who actually has power in the system, what is valued by the system, and therefore who is considered valuable by the system. Now, the closer you are to what the system norm is designed, the more advantaged or less disadvantaged you are. But the more boxes or the more aspects of this, the column on the right-hand side, you apply to you, the more intersectional difficulties that you will encounter. And it's important to bear in mind that these intersections make a big difference to people's experiences. But if you do not have a perspective that takes that into account, it can be very hard to consider what those effects are. So I said that what I wanted to focus on was understanding, and I'm going to spend a little time talking about this idea of the task of modeling minds. And one can think about this as essentially the task of understanding other minds. And we have this rather simple, basic empathy question, which is, how would I feel if I was in this person's shoes? But really what we want to know is, how does this person feel in their shoes if we're trying to understand, help, or facilitate things for a colleague who's going through some kind of difficulty? Now, this is very general. This doesn't refer specifically to disability in any way, but it's particularly pertinent, obviously. Now, how you would feel may be knowable, but how the other person feels may not be knowable, okay? Being able to understand how somebody else feels in their position means that you have to be able to have a reasonably accurate reading of what is their position actually like, and a reasonable understanding of what their mind might be like, okay? So a common mistaken belief is that I can model other minds by sort of subtracting away bits of my mind or adding bits to my mind, right? The way that we most commonly think of this is, well, if I was in this position, this is how I would be feeling. This is what I would do, right? And that essentially does it. I'll take my mind and I'll just add or subtract this particular bit. If I wasn't able to do this, or if I had to do this, how would I deal with it? Okay. And what that has baked in is the assumption that, look, all else is equal. The only thing that's different is what I understand to be the particular disadvantage or accommodation that this person needs or has to work with. Okay. I emphasize this because actually, if this is the position that one takes, then the other person is put in the position of having to explain your particular assumption in addition to the difficulties that they've already got. Okay. Now, this relates to some difficult, pervasive, and false societal beliefs that we have, certainly in this society and several others, which is a kind of assumption that, of course, my experience of my own and other people's minds doesn't capture the totality of mental experience and physical experience, but it probably covers it reasonably well. Another belief is that with a sufficient effort of will, we can ultimately think or make ourselves better or stronger, right? So, which is more, I guess, more elegantly paraphrases, people just need to try a bit harder. And so people who haven't got better or stronger have simply not tried hard enough, or that a lot of people are not even going to try and instead will try and play the system, right? Now, this may seem like a set of very sort of stark, bold statements, but just to emphasize, these are incredibly common, right? And this is what certainly, and I do have several instances of people within the university who've encountered these sort of attitudes over and over, and they're amazingly pervasive. As a psychiatrist working in community mental health services, this is something we repeatedly encounter with families, with employers, with universities. So it's the reason I'm saying that even if you may not hold this particular view, you do need to bear in mind that there are a lot of people who are part of your peer group or your seniors who do hold those views, and your colleagues and friends with chronic illnesses and disabilities will definitely have encountered people with these views at some point. Okay. And the last one is that with sufficient time and knowledge, one can understand what it would be like to be in someone else's mind, right? What this usually manifests is people seeking more and more information. I need to know what it is like for you before I can understand what it is like for you, and then decide whether I'm going to help you or not. Okay. Um, and finally, is that, again, a very pervasive idea that we can understand people's experiences in terms of linear stories that make some overall or overarching sense. And this is something we, intuitively do as humans. We try and make sense, we try and construct stories. But when you encounter experiences that don't actually fit into linear stories, that tends to throw us. And we often tend to try and find adjustments that to our mind should make these stories make sense. And again, it's part of the same thing. I need to understand before I can decide whether you need to be helped and if I'm going to help you. So related to that, people with unseen and other disabilities face some very common challenges, frustrations, or indignities. One is having to repeatedly explain one's disability and be reevaluated. And people will tell you about actually how much entitlement that different people will take to know one's medical history, right? Regardless of whether they may be HR or someone's line manager or supervisor, that, I can ask you for this information and I'll make up my own mind. It doesn't matter that other people far more qualified have already done this. You've been through formal assessments and so on. I need to know for myself. Related to that, not being believed or understood or accepted, repeated invasions of privacy. Being asked for medical information is one of them, but being asked repeatedly about, well, what exactly do you need here? Explain to me why this doesn't work for you. And being seen as an inconvenience or being unreasonable because people, are seen to be unwilling to adjust to things that actually they can't adjust to. This is one that comes up recurrently, particularly for students sitting exams or asking for accommodations for assignments and examinations, which is that somehow people are being unfairly advantaged by adjustments that they're given. And then, of course, various have you tried, you just need to, none of which are really helpful, but you look fine. So if you look fine, then you must be fine. And of course, the stigma. And what people recurrently deal with going through this is repeated disadvantage and repeated loss, right? Having to compete on an uneven playing field. Actually, that's a bit extreme. Actually, it's not really about competing. It's really just trying to function on an uneven playing field and having to give up opportunities, give up aspirations because the systems that they live in or study in or work in simply can't accommodate their needs. Okay. Now, there is some particular consideration when one thinks about the different kind of conditions or disabilities people may have. And again, this is all with a view to sort of helping you and other people understand what it might be like. So one is, what is the particular form of the condition in a person, right? Again, I don't present this as this is information you need, but this is a perspective to bear in mind, that even if someone tells you, I have this condition, say multiple sclerosis, all these conditions are extremely heterogeneous. They vary tremendously from person to person. And you can have a sort of general understanding, but that doesn't necessarily mean you understand what the version of that person's, what the particular person's version of that condition is. What is the severity in terms of what impacts does it have? What is the suffering that they have to live with? What is the stability of the condition? Now, this is particularly important because a lot of these conditions tend to fluctuate, right? And when they fluctuate, a key element is what is the predictability of the stability? So when a condition fluctuates, but with some predictable pattern, whether it be with weather or time of the month or particular kinds of stresses, it makes it easier for people to plan around it. But if it's a condition that it is fluctuating and rather unpredictable, it's incredibly difficult to plan around it. And that's important because a big part of living with disability and chronic conditions is planning your life to manage them and maximize your functioning and disruption, so that you can live as fully as possible. So I usually throw in this particular model here as a way of just thinking about functioning. So normally when we think about people's functioning, we think about functioning deteriorating at some point for some reason. In reality, you have to think about functioning in terms of a cost that's being borne to maintain that functioning. So this is just a model to try and think about that, where you think of the idea of functioning being met out of some reserve, a tank that people have got. And there's a sort of daily cost involved. And one can think of this as an energetic cost, which is required for mental multitasking and planning and time, attention and concentration, making decisions, processing emotions and social interactions, maintaining cognitive control, and just the sensory and physical aspects of processing and navigating the world. Now, we all incur a cost, and as long as you can manage the cost comfortably, things are okay. The problem is that when the cost starts to increase, and what I've listed here on this slide are things that most of us will have encountered at times when we've been very stressed or feeling burnt out, where we feel worn out, we feel less efficient, we lose our capacity for patience and empathy in dealing with the unexpected. Our confidence reduces, we become more irritable, it takes us longer to recover, and we tend to lose our spontaneity and flexibility. And as things get worse, you develop an anticipatory weariness or dread of things that are to come. And the time scales that one operates under and the decision and one makes decisions about become shorter. So I need to get through this week. How do I get through this day now? How do I get through this meeting? Right. These are things that we'd all encounter at some point. They get a lot worse when people become mentally ill, when people become burnt out. But the thing I want to emphasize is that for people who are living with chronic conditions and disability, the cost of managing their illness is always an additional one on top of what else they have to do, right? So people may be running a bit closer to this. When people's functioning starts to drop, it's really when the cost can no longer be borne. So if you return to these kind of, what is the particular form of what is the stability, what is the predictability, all of these things are important in terms of just understanding, look, what is the cost this person is having to endure to manage their level of functioning, whatever that may be, and what impacts do additional stresses or demands have on that. So when the cost goes up, these are the things that get affected. But when you're thinking about people who have ongoing conditions or long-term disabilities, and neurodiversity is a sort of good example here, these various aspects of managing being in the world are often very demanding and have always been so. So it's not about a change from before. Various conditions, ADHD, autistic spectrum disorders, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyspraxia, affect various aspects of this. And this is just the way one has to manage in the world. So how does one actually manage the additional cost required? And really one of the main things that people have to do is essentially incur a time cost. Everything takes more time. And if you're incurring a time cost, often there's an opportunity cost. There are things that you have to miss out on or end up missing out on because you simply do not have the capacity to manage that. To an extent, you can innovate, you can use alternatives, you can use adjustments, accommodations, different kinds of aids. But ultimately, you have to live with the variability and the costs. And often what people end up doing is limiting what they do. So life becomes narrower. Things have to be given up so that the things that are most necessary can be managed and dealt with. Uh, Now, of course, when one sees people, it's quite hard to get a sense of how they've limited their lives. And if you do want to understand, you have to specifically get a sense of, look, what is it that you've had to give up to be able to manage things the way that you do? So bearing that in mind, some things to remember, particularly as managers and colleagues. In any encounter, bear in mind that you're probably one instance of what is almost certainly a long history of difficult experiences for the person, in particular not being believed or taken seriously. On each instance comes the pressure to having to prove oneself and one's needs. And this is when the person has usually been through multiple formal assessments of their disability and needs. This is that you have to go through this if you need to get adjustments, because that's the way that our systems are configured. But despite having been through this, people often encounter the repeated sort of rejection of these previous assessments by someone who says, well, I need to kind of understand for myself. And that happens a lot more commonly than one would hope. And please remember, in pretty much every encounter, the person knows far more about their difficulties and their needs. So when you think about what your role is, whether it be as a manager, a colleague, a supervisor, the first thing that I suggest that one thinks about is, to fulfill my role, do I need to ascertain the nature of this person's disability? Do I need to determine whether their needs are genuine? Do I need to determine if I can believe them? And I would say the answer to all of those questions is a stonking outright no, right? But this is repeatedly what people tend to do. Let me try and figure out what it is that you're suffering with and decide whether you truly need help or not. Okay. Please remember, each time you do that, it is something that you're doing essentially for yourself. And it's usually quite humiliating and disappointing for the person who's having this done to them. Okay. Now, there's no way that I could do a talk like this and not talk about COVID, okay? And what I'm going to do, I'm going to present some rather stark sort of data from the Office of National Statistics, because disabled people of all kinds of disabilities have been hit particularly hard by COVID. So this is from the ONS release from 9th May, which is just looking at the standardized mortality rate per 100,000 person years in people with disability compared to the bottom row, which is people who are not disabled, right? And the different colors just show wave 1, wave 2, and wave 3. And the takeaway from this is that essentially the mortality, standardized mortality, is much higher in people with disability, and more so in those who are more disabled compared to those who are less disabled. And this is the case for both men and women. Okay. This is a further breakdown of those data presented in terms of hazard ratios with stepwise adjustments for age, residence, geography, demographics, pre-existing conditions, and vaccine status, right? And this is with respect to people who are not disabled. And the takeaway is that as you make these various adjustments for known risk factors, so the older you are, if you're living in communal or supported accommodation, which is a proxy for being more disabled, having more contact with people who need to provide care, and being around other people who are at increased risk, geography being part of the country, demographics and socioeconomics, poverty, so on, and people who have pre-existing conditions who have been admitted to hospital. Even when you make those adjustments, more disabled people are at increased risk of death than people who are not disabled. Right? This has been an ongoing aspect of the pandemic, and the treatment of disabled people through the pandemic has been frankly quite horrific. Okay. But the next thing that I do want to bring up is long COVID. And long COVID, for those of you who are not familiar, is a post-COVID syndrome characterized by multiple symptoms that persist well beyond the acute infection. And from the ONS release from last week, it's estimated that we have more than 2 million people with long COVID as of May this year. A couple of caveats to mention here. These are self-reported symptoms, but a lot of work has gone into this, and these self-reported symptoms should be taken as really quite important, particularly in the absence of any other systematized way of actually collecting data. But the long COVID data are really worrying. So like I said, the ONS has assayed symptoms at 4 weeks and 12 weeks. Apologies, the 12 weeks here is not terribly clear. It'll make sense on the next slide. But it's estimated 2 million people with self-reported long COVID. Of these, 22% had COVID less than 12 weeks ago, 72% at least 12 weeks ago, and of that, about 42% a year ago, and 19% at least 2 years ago. Okay, about 1.4 million people report adverse impacts on day-to-day functioning, and about 400,000 quite significant limitations in day-to-day functioning. And the most common symptoms are fatigue, shortness of breath, cough, and muscle ache. And long COVID is particularly seen, or people who are particularly at risk, are those aged 35 to 69, women, people living in more deprived areas, those in social care, teaching, education, and healthcare, and those with another activity-limiting health condition or disability. Right. The reason this is particularly important to emphasize is that people with pre-existing conditions and disabilities are at higher risk of developing long COVID. But even if you do not have any of these risk factors, you still are at risk of developing long COVID. And long COVID can be a profoundly disabling condition. In the disability world, sometimes people talk about, well, there are the people who are disabled and the people who are not yet disabled, right? And long COVID is one of those things that very clearly pushes you into the second category. And we don't have very much in this country in terms of treatment or investigations into long COVID yet, and it's not being taken sufficiently seriously. But there are a lot of us who are at risk of this and who will transition into the disabled category with long COVID, not to mention the rest of people who already have disabilities and pre-existing conditions. If you're interested, these are the symptoms of the ONS assays looking for people who've suffered these for more than 12 weeks. So weakness, tiredness, shortness of breath, loss of smell, memory, confusion, palpitations, vertigo. What we know right now about long COVID is that it's a condition that certainly has a basis in damage to the endothelium of the blood vessels, with neurological damage and with autoimmune damage. And thus you have a condition that can be widely systemic, affect multiple organs. And indeed, the data on the persistence of SARS-CoV-2 in multiple organ systems is incredibly troubling. It seems to be a highly persistent virus. So this is something that we do need to take very seriously, both in the present and for the future. And what's being done to protect people against COVID and long COVID? Well, what we have at the moment is vaccination and personal responsibility. What we have to protect disabled people or people with pre-existing conditions against COVID and long COVID is an additional dose of vaccination and even more personal responsibility. Effectively, what the plan is that people with disabilities and pre-existing conditions need to effectively continue shielding, right, for as long as this continues. And that's not really a very hopeful or helpful outlook at all. So finally, what can you do? And I'd say these are the key things. Believe people, think about the accessibility of your systems, your workplaces, What we're generally arguing for in the disability world is inclusive design rather than specific accommodations. If you make systems that are more inclusive, then everybody benefits, rather than trying to have a system that isn't inclusive and trying to make specific accommodations for different groups. And the last thing I'd say is we do need to make plans for living with COVID. And this is particularly important when you're thinking about how you're going to support your immunocompromised, disabled, and other colleagues with chronic illnesses. Okay, so I'd come back here once again to just remind you of this broader context. And this is, again, very relevant with COVID, because with COVID, we have tended to generally think about what is the comfort and desire of the group of people who are essentially in power or dominant in these systems, and not those of people who aren't. Okay, so I've come to the end. This is my usual concluding message for most of my talks. I've gone a little over time, apologies for that, but I'll stop there and take any questions people may have. Thank you so much.